you.
Thank you, and I'm good. They say you should never start a conversation by apologizing, but I'm going to break that rule because my mother-in-law unfortunately had back surgery last week, and she fell this morning. So I am in the ER with her. Um, it's not going to be as great a presentation as I would have wanted to, but nevertheless, it's going to be a presentation. She is. If you've been to the ER recently, you know there's a lot of waiting. So that's kind of where we are. I'm for those of you who know me and just scanning through the registration, I saw some familiar names. I'm a firm believer in this organization. I think it's terrific. I think that from the perspective of how we as business analysts, project managers, business architects, regardless of your role, right? Ultimately, we're in the business of solving problems. And in order to really solve problems, we have to acknowledge and we have to really understand all aspects of the situation. And one of them is risks. So when Bob and Steve and the rest of the board were looking for topics for this year, I said, hey, I would love to talk about this. I've done a couple of different conversations in years past about different topics, but this is one that really speaks nearly and dearly to my heart. I teach not just a risk class with UC Davis, but also one with UC Berkeley. And within UCLA, I teach Six Sigma, and risk is a component of that. So I'm very happy to be here tonight. Like I mentioned, it's probably going to be an abbreviated version. I probably won't do as long as a conversation as we would have. And you might hear, just like right now, the intercom blazing above me. But looking forward to chat. All right. And I really hope I wasn't on mute.
No,
we got you.
Okay. I'm Bob. I'm going to ask either you or Steve or whomever's driving to flip the slides. So is that okay?
Yep, I got it right here. Can you see the slides, Tony?
Okay. Yeah. So
okay.
You got the first one. You got the first one right now, and it showcases, right? You've got risk does not equal risky. And I do want to point out the differences among those two elements. They are often misconstrued, and they're often things that in our mind we mix together. Now, you see the beautiful picture of a tiger, gorgeous animal. For all we know, behind those leaves, there might be a stuffed animal, right? It could be a stuffed animal. It could be a real tiger. Depending on where you are, chances are it's not going to be a real tiger because real tigers just don't hang out in most places. But nevertheless, our mind, our perspective kind of tricks us to saying, oh, okay, I see stripes. There's something there I need to be worried about. If you are in the medical business, one of the things they teach aspiring medical students is that when you hear hooves, think of horses, not zebras. That means don't think of the worst possible scenario or don't think of something that's outside the realm of possibility, but rather think of the most realistic case. So keep that in mind as we go through our voyage, okay? Next slide. So I think Bob did a good service of this, so I won't spend too much time on it. I have been a member of IIBA for the last, 4 or 5 years. My attendance over the last year hasn't quite been stellar, but nevertheless, I do belong to a handful of organizations, like I mentioned. Birds of a feather flock together, and I think that is the same for BAs and PMs. All right, next one. So when it comes to risk versus risky, myself, I was an English major in college. So right off the bat, right, one is a noun, the other one's an adjective. But the most important element is that risk is really objective, whereas risky is subjective. Now, we'll spend some time talking about why that is and what elements come into play. But I do want to call out that risk, the 4-letter word, is really a fact of life. We can't avoid risk, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. Risk is just there. It's just a matter of what we do with it and how willing are we to tolerate risk. Risky or riskiness, that's another story. That's entirely up to the person. That's entirely up to the organization. And sometimes that's a big push and pull, right? That our organization might be thinking, well, I'm looking forward to doing X, whereas the person might be doing Y. And there's a gulf between those two entities that we have to bridge. Next one. When it comes to risk, and I'm speaking at this, and later on we'll talk about the different risk perspectives. There's the IIBA perspective, there's the PMI perspective, there's the Six Sigma perspective, there's the internal audit perspective. But risk is all about uncertainty. At the end of the day, the reason why something is risky is because we, and this is the royal we, the collective we, don't quite know if it's going to happen or not. And because we don't know if it's going to happen or not, we have to prepare for a handful of different scenarios. We have to prepare for a range of scenarios. And this is where our lizard brain kind of comes into play and says, yeah, okay, I don't know if you should do this. I don't know if you should do that. Well, what about this? What about that? Have you considered this? Have you considered that? These are all valid things. We've all evolved from living out there in the wild and thinking that every shadow is a threat and danger and things like that. However, as we've grown into business analysts and PMs and the like, we need to acknowledge and we need to understand that, hey, uncertainty is really the name of the game. And that's neither good nor bad. It's just a matter about how we act on it and how do we plan for it. Okay? By the way, stop me at any point. If you have any questions, just scream out and say, Tony, stop, I got a question. All right? Next one. And the second element to risk is the prior one spoke about the uncertainty, right? We don't know if it's going to happen or not. But here's the really interesting thing about risk. And this is something that if you were to ask 100 people out on the street and say, when I think of risk, what comes to your mind? They might think of negative things. And that's okay. That's just the way we've kind of come to accept it, right? Risk is bad. Ooh, I don't know. I'm uncertain. I can't prepare. Heaven knows what's going to happen. But in reality, that uncertain might come out to our benefit, right? If there is something that breaks our way, or if there's an uncertainty that comes in our perspective, that is something that is going to be good. When you take a look at the doors and you take a look at those elements, it's that element that, well, we don't know what's going to be behind it, but it might be something positive. A great example on this is imagine the last time you were on the plane. And for me, it was, about a month ago. I happened to go to work. I happened to go to a business meeting in Tampa, and then I was returning. Now, from my perspective, when I checked in for my flight, I happened to have a late flight from Tampa to Dallas, and then one from Dallas to Sacramento. So around 3 p.m., 3 hours before my flight, I got a notice from American Airlines saying, hey, FYI, your flight's going to be delayed, blah, blah, blah. And my first reaction was, crap. As much as I like Tampa, I really don't want to spend another day here. I've been here 3 days, I've been at work, blah, blah, blah. So there's the element of kind of getting to the airport and looking and saying, oh, it looks like there's an earlier flight. Let me try to get on standby. And they said, yeah, you can get on standby, right? So there's that uncertainty, but at the end, there was an opportunity. So because that flight, my original flight got delayed, I was able to kind of say, hey, look, I've got a connection to go to Sacramento. Some people might not have connections, some people might, but it behooves you, American Airlines, not to keep me on my original flight, which is delayed, because I might lose my connection and they have to put me on a hotel. All right, next one. A couple of quotes, and I'm not big into these obligatory, let me just pontificate and show quotes, but the challenge with risk management is that it is a lot of work. In risk management, we often spend a lot of time talking about what could be, what should be, what we could do. And this quote comes from General Eisenhower, not President Eisenhower, but rather General Eisenhower before he was President of the United States. And he, and I'm going to paraphrase it, right? But he talks about how, hey, plans are meaningless, but planning is very important. 50 years later, or not quite 50 years later, but 40 years later, professional boxer Mike Tyson came up with his own version of this, which was, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth, which kind of captures the element of it, right? Is that it's important to plan, but be mindful that at the end of the day, when things change, you have to change with them. That does not mean that the time that you have spent planning is wasted. It just means that, hey, If that situation did not come to pass, that's okay. That uncertainty did not arise, or maybe did not occur, or perhaps things happen in the right direction. All right, next one. So as you look at risk management, and this quote comes, if anybody is here from Chicago, so John Shedd is the gentleman for whom the Chicago Aquarium is named after. And this quote talks about how, at the end of the day, ships are very much safe in harbor, but that is not where they're supposed to be. And that's a terrific quote because it does highlight, right? When you think of Columbus, when you think of Vasco da Gama, when you think of Magellan, when you think of all of these people, they could have just hung out. They could have just said, yeah, I'm just going to hang out here. I'm really not going to go into this ocean that I don't really know about. But they took the plunge. They took the voyage. They said, there is uncertainty, but I think there is something out there. So as you think of your role as a BA or as a PM, there is the element of the unknown. There's that element of that risk, that challenge, that problem that you're trying to fix. And ultimately, it's up to you as a BA, as a PM, to kind of deal with that. And we'll talk about the specifics in a minute. All right, next one. Okay, and after this one, I'm going to take a sip of water and just pause for a second. But when it comes to risk, a lot of times the big challenge is that when you are working for an organization, you think, oh, that's a risk, that's going to be risky. Yes, okay, well, what do we plan on doing? When you want to be taken seriously, when you want something to be properly considered, you have to come up with a risk statement that talks about, hey, if this happens, what will be the challenge and what's the probability? And eventually you also think about what you would do about it. So here we talk about the statement, here we talk about the probability. And on the next slide, I go into a little bit more information about it. So if you could move to it. So the first portion of it talks about the percentage. So there's a 35% chance that something has happened. Now, I don't want you to focus about whether it's a 35% chance or a 30% chance or a 99% chance. We'll talk about that in a minute. I want you to think about the element that there is an uncertainty that we're acknowledging. We are acknowledging, we are contemplating, we are agreeing, we are moving along with the fact that, you know what, this is uncomfortable. We don't know if it's going to happen. We don't know if it's not. But we do know that if it were to happen, there's going to be a challenge. So we want to consider that in this one, there's a 35% chance that if something were to happen, like the cost reasonableness analysis were not to happen, that would delay the project. That would delay the organization. That would delay the fill in the blank. And because if that were to happen, then the change request would realistically not be done on time, and that's going to have an impact on the project. So here we are talking about a risk statement that is really, really thorough. And by that, I mean it is considering the fact that if something were to happen, the percentage, something else could occur, there's going to be an impact, and that would be due to a condition. Okay, next one. Now, the interesting thing about risks is that they come in a couple of different flavors. There's and I'm going to first name them and in any order, and then I'm going to go through the slide. But there's things that are known and things that are unknown. So a 2x2 matrix, right? You've got those that are unknown knowns, and these are often called hidden facts. So it may be something that perhaps you work in an organization that has 100 people. And 1 out of the 100 people knows about something. That person might know where the bodies are buried. That person might be the first person to work for the company. Where I'm going with this is that that person knows something that the rest of the people do not know. So that is something that is an unknown known.
Steve, Tony's still there, right?
He's still there, yeah, but I don't know if he muted on purpose or not.
Okay. I know he said he was gonna take a drink.
Son of a gun. The last thing you heard me.
You were talking about the unknown known hidden fact quadrant.
Okay. Okay, hold on just a second. Let me check if I press on something. Hold on one second.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Now we can.
Hey, Bob, can you hear me?
Now we
Now I
can.
can- yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, for some reason it thought it said that I was unsafe driving, but I can assure you that my butt is firmly planted on a bench. So anyway, I think I lost the Zoom, but okay. So then we had the unknown unknowns, right? That's where you lost me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that is what we traditionally call the black swans, because as that wonderful book states, we had these folks who kind of came across this black swan and said, well, what is that? No, that can't be. Swans are not supposed to be black. Well, I don't know about not supposed to be. Maybe you weren't used to it. Maybe you didn't know, but these things existed. And a perfect example nowadays is COVID, right? We think of like, oh, nobody could have thought of that. Well, there's a couple elements to it, right? I think that most people did not anticipate it. I think that those folks who are experts in epidemics, they knew about it. But from the viewpoint of, could we have envisioned something, or could we have prepared for a risk that would have caused people to have to work from home 2 years? You know, it depends on your company, it depends on your organization, it depends on the things, but there could have been many things that could have caused us from most of us to work remotely. Okay. I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna take a look at my phone and see if I still have the video. Okay, hold on one second. Okay, so I do not have the video. So I'm gonna have while I'm trying to log back on, I'm gonna ask Steve, can you remind me, or Bob, can you remind me what's on the lower right quadrant?
Known unknowns.
The
Known
classic
unknown.
risk.
Yep. So this is what we call the classic risk. And by that, I mean that when you are looking at a project, when you are looking at risks, you traditionally say, well, I think this could happen. And if this happens, then X or Y or Z could occur. That is the example that we went through a little bit earlier. All right. So there's a 30% chance that this happens. And if this happens, then this is going to cause X, Y, and Z. And then on the bottom left, you have the known knowns. And those are facts. These are things that should not be called risks. And this is something that we as BAs, as PMs, need to call out very strongly. Like if somebody says, well, that is a risk because of X, Y, and Z, and we say, well, isn't that the current situation? If that is the current situation, it's no longer a risk. It's an issue. It's happening. Okay. To give you sort of a real life scenario, let's say that you are planning your wedding and you're planning your wedding in the Sacramento area. Okay. And you say, I want to have my wedding in December. Well, there's a chance that it might rain in December. Nowadays, unfortunately, it's not as common, right? But there's a chance that it might rain. If you don't want rain to ruin your wedding, you have a couple of different opportunities. But what you cannot say is to wake up the day of your wedding and have it be a downpour and say, well, that's a risk. No, it's not a risk. That is happening. It's already happening. It's an issue. Okay? We'll talk about that in the context of probability next. All right, I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to try to log back on to the video. So bear with me for about 1 minute, okay? Okay, I think I'm back on video. Can you move to the next slide? All right. So when it comes to identifying risk, here's a couple of ideas, right? You can always just sit down with your colleagues and think of like, oh, what if this? What if that? What if this? But there are a couple tricks that we'll cover in the next couple of slides. The first one is called a risk prompt that goes by the acronym or by the name of PESTLE. So that is for political, economical, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So your mileage may vary depending on your project. Your mileage may vary depending on what you're doing. But PESTLE, P-E-S-T-L-E, would allow you to kind of look and identify risks based on these prompts. The next one, if you wouldn't mind, it's TCOP, and that is for technological,
I think we lost your audio, Tony.
so again, it thinks that I am driving. I don't know why, but TCOP. So technological, I'm going by memory here, economical, commercial, operational, and political. I might be mistaken a few. This is not these are the only options that would occur. These are more of sort of guidelines that you can use when you're guiding your conversation, your brainstorm, regardless of whether you're working on operations, regardless of working on a project, as to identifying those risks. Which, by the way, one of the main things that you will do is to kind of sit down with your group and say, hey, let's identify some risks. Let's think of some risks. Okay? Thoughts on this? Questions as I try to go back on?
Tony, I think we lost you again. At this point, I think it's more of an issue than a risk.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk into my phone rather than put it in my ear. So, all right,
Okay.
move on from TCOP. All right, so I spoke about an issue already happened. And now here's the thing. It's a risk has, by definition, a chance of happening that is between 1% and 99%. Okay. Now, obviously I'm rounding up, right? You could have a 0.00001%. But where I'm going with this is that if something has a 0% chance of happening, it's an impossibility. It's not a risk, right? If I say tomorrow the sun will not rise, unlikely. We've got billions and billions and billions of years of history. Now, if I say tomorrow the sun will rise, well, yes, that is a certainty that it will happen. When you think of this, it's important because this takes into consideration how you would prepare for the risk. Now, if you are lottery fanatics, you know that the only way to win at lottery is to not play, okay? If a lottery ticket is $1 and you don't play, you don't lose your dollar. Now, if you're playing the Powerball, you have a 1 in 292 million chance of winning the Powerball. Now, that's because you have to choose a number between 1 and 69, another number between 1 and 68, another number between 1 and 67, another number between 1 and 66, and another number between 1 and 65, and oh, by the way, another number between 1 and 26. The first 5 numbers cannot match each other. So that is, if the number 33 is chosen, the other 4 numbers cannot be 33. So in order for you to have a certainty that you will win the lottery, you would have to spend $292 million by buying every single ticket for every single possibility. Now, 1, it's unlikely. If you have $292 million laying around, chances are you're not going to spend that money playing the lottery. And 2, even if you say, well, I'm going to rig this because I'm going to play every single ticket, you have no certainty that somebody else will do the same. You have no certainty that somebody else is going to have a winning ticket. Maybe that a person only spent $1, but they beat the odds and they had that 1 in 292 million. So from the perspective of the risk, you could stack the odds for you and just say, well, I'm going to play every bet. But even then, somebody who is doing something on the remote end could still win the same amount of money this year. Okay. Next slide. The second component here is the first one being probability, of course, but the next one is impact. Now, the traditional sort of scope of, not scope, the traditional perspective of impact is you're going to take a look at the scope, the cost, and the schedule. And for those of you who are into project management, you know that's a triple triangle, right? It's a triple constraint. You want to take a look at how something will affect the project by taking a look at how much it will delay the project, how much it will cost versus the budget, and how much it will affect the scope. Now, you could take a look at this from the perspective of quality. You could take a look at this from the perspective of legal implications. There's a couple of other angles that you can do. But where I'm going with this is that to really gauge the impact or to really gauge how that risk is going to affect your project, you want to take a look at the probability and you want to take a look at the impact. There are some risks that have a very big impact and a very low probability. And there are some risks that have a very high probability and a very low impact. The worst case scenarios, you can imagine, are those that have both a high probability and a high impact. Okay, next slide. To give you an example, assume that you were leaving out of San Francisco Airport. And I'm using San Francisco here rather than Sacramento, but for all practical purposes, right? You're leaving out of San Francisco Airport and that plane is off by 1 degree. If that plane is off by 1 degree, it doesn't seem like a big issue, right? You take a look at the impact and say, oh, okay, whatever. But that plane would land in Philadelphia rather than New York City, or if you wish, in New York City rather than Philadelphia. So when you actually take a look at the probability and the impact, it's pretty big. At the end of the day, if you wish to land in New York City and you land in Philadelphia or vice versa, you're not going to be very happy. So it just showcases how the combination of those two elements is what we really ought to look at rather than just one of them. All right. Now, what do we do? As good PMs, as good BAs, we want to make sure that we have response planning. We want to make sure that we have a good idea as to how we are going to go about doing this and what we're going to do if something happens. It's not enough to just raise the risk, right? It's just one of those things that we got to say, okay, well, what if that were to happen? What do we do? And that allows you to be multiple steps ahead. Not because it enables you to kind of get a good sense of how would you react, but it also allows you to kind of socialize that idea, socialize that element, socialize that perspective with all of the other groups, all of the other elements within, again, your project or organization. All right, next one. The biggest thing that I have seen in my professional experience, as Bob said, I do have a couple decades worth of this with a couple different industries, but when risk occurs, people become paralyzed. Now we've known about analysis paralysis, right? That's where we have too much information and we don't know what to do. Sometimes it's not about too much information. Sometimes instead it's about saying, okay, I had an idea, but now that it's happened, what do I do? A great example on this is if you happen to be a gambler, if you happen to be around gamblers, right? You might have somebody who says, well, I'm only going to bet $100. And then once they're down $100 and they realize, well, I'm down instead of up, they might loathe to kind of commit to the strategy that they react to, okay? Or they might go to an auction and they might say, well, I'm only going to go as high as $300 for the painting. And the next thing you know, the painting is going for $301 and their strategy goes out the window. So having a strategy allows us to prevent that paralysis, to prevent that sort of deer in headlights look, and to prevent that perspective of saying, well, I don't know what to do. Next one. Bear with me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. Now, I do want to call out, I've spoken about risk as sort of like a one big element. Nowadays, it's more in fashion to talk about VUCA, VUCA, and that is all the elements of risk. The first one is volatility. So it's not just about something being volatile, but also how fast. So when you think of your car, press the accelerator, it goes from 0 to 60. The next one is uncertainty, which we spent some time talking about, right? The hallmark. I don't know about this. I don't feel comfortable. It's not a good feeling. I don't like it, blah, blah, blah. Next one is complexity, which is all about how complex is this? How many layers, how many elements does it present to you, to your customers, to your peers, to your partners, et cetera, et cetera. And also how much is ambiguity. So it's not just about what may or may not happen because you just don't know the probability, but rather ambiguity. Hey, your things, your assumptions that I'm putting into place that I really don't feel too confident about, right? I guess Bob could do this, or I guess Steve could do this, or I guess Amy could do that, or I guess Jean could do that. So these are all things that you ought to take into consideration. For those of you who are members of both IIBA and PMI is shifting more towards a VUCA or a VUCA perspective rather than just standard risk. And I'll talk a little bit about what IIBA is thinking about in a few slides. All right. So what do we do? At the end of the day, when you have identified a risk, when you have quantified the risk, both in terms of probability, both in terms of impact, you want to figure out what options do we have. Now, if you have an opportunity that is a positive risk, you have a set of options to respond. If you have a negative risk, which is a threat, you also have a set of opportunities. Now, there are two that, as you can see from the slide, they are in both, and that is accept and escalate. They are in both because they are sort of middle of the road. You can accept the risk and say, well, there's not a whole lot we can do. We just got to deal with it. And you can also escalate the risk by saying, well, it's going to happen, so I'm just going to tell my boss. These are not bad options. However, what I always tell my students is that these are not options that should be by themselves. These are sort of side dishes, not main dishes, but side dishes. And as such, these should also be looked into in consideration with the other main dishes. The main dishes for opportunities would be enhanced, exploit, and share. I'm going to start with share, and that is, imagine that you're working for a company that is really good at developing drugs, that is developing medicines, but you're really bad at marketing. Maybe it's because you don't have the expertise, maybe you just suck at it, okay? If you partner with a company that is really good at it, you can share that risk, and that is both of you can benefit from it. The next one is enhance, which means that if you have a 30% risk that something is going to go, a 30% probability, I should say, that something is going to go your way, by enhancing it, you take a series of actions that's going to increase that possibility from 30% to say 50%. And exploiting is when you make it into a certainty. Okay, so that is the big difference between enhance and exploit. Over on the other side, you have transfer, which is the classic example here is insurance. So you think something might happen and you want to protect yourself, you take insurance. So for those of us who have car insurance, health insurance, homeowners insurance, umbrella insurance, renters insurance, that is the classic element. We protect ourselves by saying, well, I'm going to take a policy, and if this were to happen, instead of being out $100,000, I might be out $1,000. Okay. And the other two are mitigate and avoid. Mitigate is when we try to reduce the possibility of the risk occurring. Okay. We say, if this were to happen, this would occur. So therefore, I am going to try to reduce the possibility of that happening. Avoidance is where we completely remove the risk. And that is where we actually remove it from the project or from the product. So let's say that you want to get married in Sacramento in the winter and you're concerned about rain. You can either move your wedding indoors, or you can move your wedding to, say, the summer, where there's virtually a 0% chance of it raining. Okay. Next one. As I mentioned, there are a couple of different risk viewpoints. The first one is, I'm going to start left to right. The first one is from the Babok. So risk is all about an uncertainty. Now, the Babok doesn't itself talk about positive or negative. It just talks about uncertainty. Now, from what we have read today, you know that it can be both positive and negative. The next one is PMI, which again talks about positive and negative. And then there's Six Sigma, which talks about the possibility of really measuring for all the things that could occur. And lastly, there is internal audit, which helps us come to terms what could happen. Steve, Bob, I'm going to drop for about 5 minutes and I'll be right back. Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
While
Somebody-
while Tony's away, I'll share one little interesting story, which is true. I was taking a class in college and they were talking about risk, and one of the instructors said that he was in a philosophy class and they had their final exam. So the teacher, gives them their little blue booklet to write in, things, but nothing else. So they're all like wondering, well, what's going on here? What's going to be the final exam? And the teacher said, here's your final exam. You need to answer this question. What is risk? So he said his buddy got up like a minute, 2 minutes later, handed his booklet in, and he wound up getting an A. So he said to his buddy, what did you do? Like, what did you write? He said, I just wrote, this is, and handed it in.
That's great.
So, he didn't have to write about it. He demonstrated it. And the other thing that's interesting about risk is, there's risk and reward, right? So sometimes if you're going to take a risk, it has to be worth the risk, that it has to be, the reward has to be commensurate with the risk. So a good example is like the stock market. You could put your money in the market now, which is has been a risky proposition. Or you could leave it in a bank getting 1 or 2%. And the risk of that is you're not taking on a lot of risk, so you're not getting a lot of reward, but you risk falling behind your standard of living if you can't keep up with inflation. And I'm not saying to do one or the other, but with the stock market, historically through the years, with all the ups and downs, including the Great Depression, it's averaged almost 10%, right, in the long run. So, but it's risky, but you expect to get paid more for taking that risk. So, that's what risk is. It's also tied to reward. And there's different strategies, some risk is good, you want to take on more because there's opportunities. Some risk is bad because bad things could happen. But there's also a tie to, especially in the financial markets, that if someone's asking you to take more of a risk, then you expect more of a return. And if the return isn't worth the risk, then you don't do it. It sounded like someone maybe had a question. And maybe Steve, just to save a little bit of time at the end, I don't know if you want to do the raffle now or a last call for the raffle.
We'll do a last call. So if you want to put your name in the chat, if you didn't already get on Menti, or if you're on Menti, I'm on the raffle slide. So either way, in a few minutes, I've got 13 names in here so far, and there's 23 people online. So.
And just a reminder, when Tony's done, there's going to be a brief quiz. We're also going to do a raffle. Steve will be sending out a survey. There'll be a raffle prize associated with the people who respond to that survey and put their name in, to be entered into the raffle. I usually fill out the survey and I'll put something funny in it so Steve knows it's me filling it out. but I don't put my name in, because I don't want to win any of the raffles. I think it would be.
Hey, Steve, Bob, I'm back. Sorry,
Yeah,
Okay.
no problem.
I was being removed from a place to another. So, all right. Like I mentioned, apologies. We're gonna do an abbreviated version of this. However, if you have any questions about today's topic, by all means, do contact me. Steve and Bob will make my email address available. I do want to briefly talk about, a couple scenarios on risks and how it would be addressed. So the first one is, if you go to the next slide. So when you are working on business analysis from an IIBA perspective, from a business analysis element, we're not just looking at projects. Now, projects have a start and a finish. Projects have a particular goal in mind. Projects themselves nest under programs, and programs themselves nest under projects. And what I tell my students in my UC Davis and my UC Berkeley class is that I think of the Olympics. So you've got the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics. And they are themselves part of a program, because you're looking at the Olympics for that year, or the Olympics for that perspective, for that cycle. And then you also look at the perspective of the portfolio. So depending on where you start, from the bottom or the top, you can take a look at, okay, well, maybe the portfolio is the 2024 Olympics. And I actually don't know exactly where they're being held, but those Olympics, there's a lot of different projects that kind of go into place. You're taking a look at maybe the track and field events, and you're taking a look at the stadium events, and you're taking a look at the aquatic events and the like. And then within projects, you're taking a look at, okay, we got to sell tickets, we got to build stadiums, we got to do this, we got to do that, we got to plan for these things. When you actually take a look at below that triangle and you see operations, there are things that happen regardless of whether we're talking about the 2024, the 2026, the 2028, the 2030 Olympics, right? We're talking about, hey, how do we get sponsorships? Well, the Olympic Games, there's some funds that come into play year in and year out, but you're also talking to your Coca-Colas, your McDonald's, your Visas, et cetera, et cetera. So from that element, there's all the things that come into play that are really operations rather than projects. And as a result, there's a lot of different angles that ought to be considered when it comes to risk. Okay. Next slide. So let's take an example of risk, right? So originally I was going to say the risk with IIBA could be, hey, maybe IIBA itself, or take the Sacramento chapter, right? Maybe Steve, Bob, and the rest of the board, they don't have enough speakers for the year. So they got to scramble, they got to look for other speakers, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they cancel events. Case in point, today, right? Steve pinged me and said, hey, Tony, are you coming? I said, yes, I'll be right there. Here's what's happening. My mother-in-law's in the emergency room, et cetera, et cetera. Take a look and just think of the next couple of months, right? So Halloween is coming up. So if you are in your house, do you have enough candy? Do you buy enough candy? Do you want to even offer candy? And if you don't, is your house going to be egged, et cetera, et cetera? What about Thanksgiving? Are you going to host? Are you going to allow somebody else to host? Are you going to sort of split the duties, et cetera, et cetera? Or when you're talking about the holidays, maybe you're on a budget and you're trying to figure out, gee, I really can't spend more than X. So maybe you can hope to address that by necessarily sticking to your budget, or maybe you say, hey, you know what? I'm just going to buy gift cards to all these stores, and that way, when I spend enough money from those gift cards and I'm done, there's nothing else I can do. So there's all those perspectives that you can do in terms of the addressing risks. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to go bottom left to right. So bottom left, my favorite sport is baseball. I'm a big baseball fan. And one of the big trends with baseball is that It used to be that you as a young player would wait until you became a free agent. That means until you spent a certain amount under the control of your franchise before you're able to go and offer your services for the highest bidder. And what you're looking at right now is that a lot of young players are actually saying, you know, I'm not going to take that chance. I'm not going to wait until 6 years down my career and hope for a big payday. But if an organization is willing to give me not super high big bucks, but moderately big bucks to play for 10 years, I'm going to take that. I could perhaps strike it higher if I waited, but this is also going to give me that certainty of mind, that peace of mind. And the next example is, you see the Ghostbusters logo, and this is one of my, by far, my favorite examples. So when Ghostbusters, the movie, was being filmed, all of a sudden, Warner Brothers realized that, oh, we actually don't own the rights to the name. Instead, a rival studio had it. So what they ended up doing was they filmed all of the scenes that actually had somebody saying the word Ghostbusters. They filmed those scenes twice. One with Ghostbusters, they were saying the word Ghostbusters, and the other one was the word Ghost Breakers. In the off chance that Warner Brothers Studios could not secure the rights from the competitor to use the word Ghostbusters, to use, you know, by the term. That cost a little bit of money, of course. They had to record this twice, but nevertheless, it gave them the certainty that, hey, you know, we got an out. If something were to happen, we can certainly make it happen, and we can certainly get that movie out the door. So from that perspective, it was a terrific example in how to address risk. Up on the very right, you see the airplane example. Now, I spoke a little bit about this with my perspective from my recent trip to Tampa, but if you have been in a position where your flight gets oversold, you know how airlines are trying to sort of make the best out of this. The airlines recognize that not everybody who buys a ticket is going to show up. So they purposely oversell the planes, knowing that if they win 90% of the time, it more than makes up for that 10% of the time that they lose, and they have to offer somebody else a ticket and compensation and the like. So it's an example of risk from both parties, right? From the perspective of the airline, it makes sense to oversell that flight. From the perspective of the would-be traveler, it makes sense to kind of run the risk, if you would, and say, well, I can probably get something out of it. And lastly, I think I've used this one, right? The wedding. So from your viewpoint, depending on when you want to get married and what kind of wedding you want to have, it might make sense to have it outside in the winter. It might make sense to have it outside in the summer. What occurs here is you want to have that perspective. You want to have that element of figuring out how to go about doing it. So if you really have your heart set on an outdoor wedding in December, you can go ahead and do it, but it really behooves you to have that mitigation perspective to say, hey, maybe I have a backup. Maybe there is an indoor portion of my location where I can actually have my wedding. All right. And see, I think that is the last slide. Can you just double check?
That is the last slide.
Awesome. So I'm going to drop. I really apologize, but I do have a couple things that I do want to check on my mother-in-law. But by all means, any questions, feel free to collect, send it my way, and I will do my best to answer by the end of the week.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Thanks
Yeah,
so
we're going
much,
to.
Tony.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you all.
I hope everything's okay with your mother-in-law.
Yeah. Hopefully it's on the mend. Just some rehab for her back. No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Steve, I guess we could probably just jump right into the quiz and then we'll wrap up. Thanks.
All right, I'm stopping the recording.